30,000 riders, horses steaming in the cold, their breaths like small grey clouds under a bruised winter sky. Lanterns bob on lances, leather creaks, and the rhythm of hooves drags a long, patient threat across the frozen fields of Central Europe. For 2 generations, the Mongol name had been a summons to terror. Cities emptied, armies shattered, the smoke of conquered towns framing an image of inevitability. They had swept through the continent with a new kind of violence, fast, coordinated, almost surgical. They did not merely destroy, they unmade the expectations of every Western commander who had met them. And yet, in the winter of 1287-1288, that same image of invincibility met something it had not expected. Something deliberate, constructed, and terrifying in its own way. A trap born of memory, remade strategy, and patient engineering. This is the story of a forbidden past many later chroniclers would forget or render as legend. How a realm scarred by earlier defeats refused to be defined by them, rebuilt itself, and turned Mongol strength into weakness. If this dive into medieval warfare is your kind of history, like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this reconstruction. The Mongol machine that rode into Poland at the close of the 1280s was not an accident of numbers alone. It was the product of an imperial system that had learned how to use speed as an instrument and intelligence as a blade. From the open steppe of Asia, mounted archers had mastered a form of war that treated the battlefield as a moving puzzle. Feint, observe, exploit. The composite bow, small and powerful, allowed a rider to loose a rain of arrows without stopping. Horses bred for endurance carried men who could fight day after day. The feigned retreat, false flight luring the enemy into disorder, was a tactical doctrine with murderous consequences. Above all, Mongol campaigns relied on information. Scouts that probed and reported, local informants turned into sources, and a command culture that could recombine detachments and routes at speed. For Europeans who faced them, these qualities added up to a single terrifying experience. In 1241, a contingent of Mongol horsemen met Polish and Allied forces and left an imprint of catastrophe. Wooden palisades burned. Cavalry charges were baited into ambushes. Knights who pursued fleeing Mongols found themselves stretched into isolated pockets and slaughtered. In 1259, further raids reiterated the lesson. Mobility plus discipline could outmatch armor and numbers if those numbers were misused. These were not abstract lessons. They lived in the mouths of survivors, in ruined villages, and in the nervous calculations of dukes. Poland, like its neighbors, carried the shock through decades. Its social and political landscape, fragmented duchies, local noble retinues, towns with communal militias, was poorly suited to meet an enemy whose advantages were systemic rather than occasional. For a time, defeat seemed structural. Pine palisades, hastily erected fortifications, and reactive field armies were all answers to the wrong question. But memory is not always paralyzing. Sometimes it sharpens. The Poland that would face the Mongol return in 1287 had spent the intervening decades learning not just to fear the Mongols, but to study them and, crucially, to engineer around them. That process would not be sudden. It was a slow, almost administrative revolution. Stone replaced wood, garrisons trained to hold. Crossbows and siege engines became common tools in the defensive arsenals, and where previously local lords acted like independent captains, emerging centers of authority attempted to coordinate defense. The trap was not one single device, but a layered strategy: hold in fortress, harry the raiders. Then, when the enemy had been bled and fixed, concentrate force to strike. Stone did more than keep flame at bay. It altered the Mongol equation. Their system excelled at movement and at creating opportunities in the field. Sieges and stubbornly defended walls transformed that mobility into a liability. A stone keep forced Mongol commanders into time-consuming operations. Longer sieges meant supply lines stretched, detachments dispersed, and the very reconnaissance that had been their advantage became a source of noise and misdirection. Likewise, equipping defenders with crossbows and improving artillery, mangonels and trebuchets where available, created a psychological barrier. Cavalry charges that had once creamed through wooden barricades found themselves receiving volleys and stones that decimated formations before they closed. Discipline mattered as much as stones and iron. The Polish duchies were not a unitary state in the modern sense, but figures like Duke Leszek II, known in some sources as Leszek the Black, worked to centralize authority on the battlefield at critical moments. Leszek could not make a modern standing army out of medieval Poland, but he could insist on controlled responses. Do not chase, do not break ranks, hold on the walls, and let the enemy grind themselves against defenses, while smaller units harassed and sapped them. Light cavalry turned into hunters rather than headlong chargers. Communal militias were drilled to hold ground and support counterattacks. The cumulative effect was a change in the character of Polish defense from reactive to premeditated, an adaptive system designed to take advantage of Mongol vulnerabilities. Adaptation also meant alliances and logistics. Hungary's military commitments, diplomatic ties with neighboring princes, and the ability to muster relief forces when a city was threatened became part of a broader strategy. Tributary or vassal dynamics shifted as Polish leaders learned to bring external cavalry and professional soldiers into the field, not merely as mercenaries, but as coordinated bodies that could perform the role of counter-mobility. The aim was simple: transform the battlefield into a place where Mongol mobility could be checked, attrition could set in, and the invaders' operational freedom be curtailed long enough for a concentrated response. In late autumn of 1287, two Mongol columns crossed into the territories north of the Carpathians. Contemporary sources are fragmentary. Chroniclers who wrote decades later would give different spellings and sometimes contradictory details. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that two principal leaders appear in the sources. Talabuga, often transliterated Talibuga in various chronicles, commanded a northern column, while Nogai, sometimes spelled Noai, a remarkable and independently powerful general in his own right, led a southern column. The strategy was classic Mongol operational art: split into columns for rapid movement and widespread plundering, probe defenses, and seek to extract tribute, captives, and resources. The expectation, from the Mongol point of view, was that these columns could operate semi-independently. They could raid towns, gather intelligence, and fall back when necessary. But assumptions about easy victory underestimated one central fact. Poland in 1287 was no longer the same soft field of prey it had once been. Talabuga's column, moving north, found a landscape where fortresses had been rebuilt in stone, and garrisons no longer fled at the first shock of enemy arrows. Towns that in 1241 had been quick to burn now stored food, reinforced walls, and sheltered cavalry reserves. Kala names in the sources shift and blur, and some place names remain indefinido in later annotations, was one of those towns where Mongol siege techniques met a new barrier. The Mongols, masters of quick sieges and strategic pressure, now confronted walls that required real investment of time and manpower. A protracted siege changed the campaign's calculus. Scouts reported where supplies were thin, detachments were sent to forage, and the columns that had started together now found themselves dispersed by the necessities of prolonged operations. Nogai's southern column proceeded toward other targets with familiar effectiveness: swift raids against smaller settlements, lightning attacks on weakly defended hamlets. But he, too, encountered pockets of resistance, stone keeps and prepared defenses that ate into campaign tempo. In one notable episode recorded unevenly across the chronicles, a fortress listed under names variously transcribed as Krov, Kruf, Kov, in different manuscripts, resisted a Mongol assault longer than expected. The Mongols employed standard measures: Siege engines assembled from captured wood, the use of incendiaries where possible, and the deployment of engineers to undermine gates. But where a strong stone curtain and prepared defenders held, the cost in time and men grew. These early frustrations mattered. Mongol strength was not immutable, it was dynamic. It depended on momentum, on the ability to outmaneuver and outpace opposition. The longer a campaign stalled at a single point, the more opportunities there were for the defender to alter the operational picture, gather reinforcements, consolidate command, and choose the moment for a decisive strike. Polish leaders, aware of this logic, did not merely huddle behind walls. They pursued a three-stage method. Hold in fortress, harass the dispersed raiding parties, then concentrate for a targeted counterblow that turned protracted sieges from a Mongol advantage into a vulnerability. Part of that methodology rested on small unit harassment. Harassment units did not aim to win pitched battles. They sought to pick the Mongol force apart, raid supply convoys, and force detachments to scatter in search of forage and plunder. These hunter groups were often local, light cavalry skirmishers familiar with the terrain, river-borne parties that could strike camps at night, and mounted crossbowmen who used cover and heavier missile weapons to sap morale. Tradition holds, in later Polish chronicling, a dramatic account of river raftsmen, locals who used the network of rivers to reach Mongol encampments under cover of night and set fires, release horses, and kill sleeping soldiers. Those episodes are presented by the sources as folklore mixed with memory. They capture popular imagination and may reflect real guerrilla actions, but they should be read with caution. According to the chronicles, such raids did more than damage supplies. They unmoored Mongol confidence, making senior commanders more cautious and more likely to split forces to secure tenuous lines of communication. Another instrument of Polish defensive rebirth was the wider use of artillery and defensive projectiles. Catapults and mangonels, not new in Europe, were adapted to the local situation. Improvised platforms hurled stones and incendiary material to devastating effect on cavalry that attempted to close with walls. The interplay of crossbows and artillery created zones where Mongol horsemen could not operate with impunity. The steppe tactics that relied on space for feigned retreats and reassembly faced a narrowing funnel where every meter of ground required exchange and risk. Yet adaptation alone does not win wars. It creates opportunity. Victory still relies on command, timing, and sometimes luck. The political scene in Poland at the turn of the 1290s was complex. Rival dukes and regional magnates maintained their independence, but in the face of an external menace, coalitions formed. Duke Leszek II, the figure who emerges in the sources as the most visible focus of Polish coordination during the campaign, was not a monarch in the modern, centralized sense. Still, he exerted influence, organizing garrisons, coordinating relief columns, and using diplomacy to secure cavalry contingents from allies such as Hungary. The presence of Hungarian cavalry under commanders cited in sources, one named George Bucker in some chronicles, would later prove meaningful when relief forces had to move quickly to contest Mongol operations. Such alliances were not guaranteed to change outcomes, but they enriched Polish options and added a layer to the defensive trap, the possibility that what the Mongols believed to be dispersed raiding parties might, in fact, be bait for a larger, concentrated strike. Operational friction began to show most plainly in the winter months. Mongol armies excelled at campaigning across the steppes' long horizons, but the forests, rivers, and constructed fortresses of Poland imposed a different geometry on the fight. Snow narrowed passes, rivers iced and thawed unpredictably, and local defenders used the landscape to create kill zones. At one point, a northern column under Talabuga found itself operating in terrain that denied the freedom of maneuver critical to Mongol success. The Mongols, whose tactics required a capacity to keep detachments united or to rejoin them quickly, were obliged to detach units to secure foraging parties and to protect siege works. These detachments, when isolated, became prey for the very harassment units that Polish commanders had cultivated. Siege warfare against stone walls exposed not only tactical weaknesses but logistical ones. The Mongol supply model assumed quick victories, the taking of plunder and fodder from conquered towns, and the swift movement of horses and men. When walls held, forage became scarce, horses weakened, communication lines between columns lengthened. The famous Mongol scouts, once a source of precise knowledge, now delivered reports muddied by rumor and the confusion of dispersed columns. That confusion mattered. Mongol commanders, accustomed to a high degree of centralized operational flexibility within an environment of speed, found themselves forced into decisions that would multiply risk. Detach for local suppression, commit men to long sieges, or attempt to force a breakthrough with frontal assaults against prepared masonry. At Sanders, one of the strongholds named in chronicled accounts, the Mongols tried familiar methods. They hurled themselves against the walls, constructed siege ramps where possible, attempted to batter gates, and probed for weak points. Defenders answered with rocks from catapults, volleys of crossbow bolts, and sorties that harried engineers and burned scaling ladders. Contemporary sources are not unanimous on every detail. The place name itself appears in variant forms across manuscripts. What emerges clearly, however, is that the siege did not turn quickly, and that Mongol patience thinned. For defenders, each hour mattered. For attackers, each hour meant more time for relief forces to assemble and for detachments to be cut off. These early days of attrition changed the tenor of the campaign. The Mongol columns, designed to be flexible and to keep options open, began to show a fatal fragmentation. Talabuga's detachments were sent north and east in search of food and easier targets, while Nogai, operating to the south, split his own forces among several objectives. The logic of the Mongol operational model, which typically relied on speed and cohesion, lost one of its critical advantages: unity. At the same time, Polish leaders did not remain passive spectators. The three-stage defensive plan, defend, harass, concentrate, was activated. Garrisons held places like Krov and Sanders, harassment units stroked the edges of Mongol detachments, and diplomatic channels urged Allied cavalry to move toward threatened sectors. The aim was to make the invader bleed time and men, to deny the Mongols the ability to gather swift intelligence on the entire theater of operations, and then to exploit their dispersal with a focused counterstroke. Still, the battlefield is a theater of uncertainty. Chroniclers, writing years afterward, would strain to find names and to ascribe motives. They would, in some accounts, celebrate popular heroics, raftsmen running torches along a river and surprising entire encampments, or mention grisly discoveries like the identification of high-born bodies through odd, intimate details. These anecdotes took on lives of their own, vivid, memorable, but often impossible to verify. According to tradition, the river raids did more than inconvenience the Mongols. They struck a blow at morale. But the historian's duty is to hold such stories gently, fascinating and useful for understanding how people remembered the past, but not necessarily proof of a decisive military fact. Nevertheless, human factors, courage, fatigue, the willingness of a garrison to hold, intersected here with organizational change. As winter tightened its grip, the Mongol columns, now extended and increasingly cautious, faced a decision: press forward in the hope of breaking one of the stone keeps, or withdraw to regroup and winter elsewhere. The decision was made more acute by reports, sometimes delayed or confused, of actions taken by other columns. Commanders like Talabuga and Nogai, though capable and battle-hardened, were not infallible. Divided command, stretched lines, and the unexpected resilience of their targets combined in ways they had seldom experienced on European soil. One moment crystallized the campaign's new arithmetic. Talabuga's northern column had been moving through restrictive terrain where mobility, the Mongol sine qua non, was curtailed. Harassment had worn at the edges of his detachments. Supplies were thinning. Commanders reported sighting prepared Polish forces, small, disciplined bodies under centralized command, holding likely approaches and forcing the Mongols to attempt risky frontal assaults. At that point, a message arrived. Nogai's southern column, engaged in its own sieges, had run into stiff defenses and raids that threatened to cut its lines. The two Mongol leaders faced a growing sense of strategic enclosure. Every day spent stuck before walls was another day closer to facing a concentrated counterstrike. It is in these moments, when the rhythm of a campaign alters from movement to attrition, that the trap reveals itself. No longer did Poland need to match the Mongol in the open field and outpace them. It needed to be patient, to force the invaders into choices that played to the defenders' strength, time, prepared positions, the ability to bring allied cavalry to a decisive point. The trap was not a single pit dug into the earth. It was a system of time and terrain, of stone and calculation. It was forbidden in the sense that it ran counter to the assumptions of the age. The Mongols assumed that speed and shock could overcome fortresses. Poland built stone to make the Mongols pay for that assumption. For the Mongols, the consequence was an erosion of initiative. For the Poles, it was an opening. If a relief force could be assembled, if detachments could be lured into exposed positions, and if the Hungarians could be persuaded to commit cavalry under the right commander at the right moment, then the dispersed invader might become a target for a concentrated blow. Duke Leszek and his advisers understood this. They had seen the enemy's playbook and bent it against him. The coming days would test whether patient engineering and controlled command could translate into battlefield victory. Scouts reported movement, detachments trying to rejoin columns, raiding parties returning with prisoners, and Mongol camps thick with horses but thin with fodder. The weather, too, had a vote. Snow and thaw could stall movement or turn a river into a bridge. Against this shifting background, Polish commanders moved their pieces with a new confidence. Yet the story was far from complete. Fractures in the Mongol plan were evident, and opportunities presented themselves. But the Mongol army remained a dangerous, adaptable foe. A single rash move could still fracture Polish cohesion. A sudden feigned retreat could still lure undisciplined forces into disaster. The trap had been set, but setting a trap is not the same as springing it. For that, timing and luck would have to meet preparation, and for a moment both sides stood on the brink, feeling the balance tilt, but not yet certain which way it would fall. The first blows of winter hardened into ice, and with them the resolve of those who had waited for the moment to strike. Scouts reported Mongol detachments straggling to secure forage and to take advantage of thinly defended homesteads. Word moved faster in the Polish command than in the scattered invaders' camp. Leszek's lieutenants, men who had learned to read Mongol patterns, did not hope for a single lightning victory. They wanted to produce a deliberate breakdown in cohesion. In the fields around a place, the chronicles name with variants. Wechkow in some manuscripts, Wag or Wesgau in others. A trap, patient and not spectacular, began to close. What happened at Wechkow was not a Hollywood charge, but a study in geometry and patience. Open into forest and marsh, the ground narrowed the space where horse archers could perform their signature maneuvers. Instead of offering open steppe, the terrain offered funnels and hedgerows. Polish commanders arrayed forces to deny the Mongols the room to circle and reform. Light cavalry and mounted crossbowmen abandoned the idea of meeting the enemy in a duel of speed. They shadowed, seized tangles of ground, and used both earthworks and wagon-launched obstacles to channel horsemen into kill zones. From behind, prepared earthworks and stone breastworks, crossbow bolts crashed into horses and riders. Mangonels hurled masses of stone into clustered formations. Where Mongol discipline might once have turned a feigned flight into a slaughter of pursuers, the Poles now sought to reverse that trick. Feigned disarray from their own skirmishers invited Mongol pursuit only into prearranged fields of fire. The turning moment at Waghoff came when the Mongols, fooled into believing they had forced a gap, pushed forward a substantial detachment. For a time, they seemed to recover the initiative. Columns reformed, riders galloped to close, arrows emptied the air. Then artillery, previously held in reserve, opened. The thunder of rocks crashing through horse ranks, the screams of wounded animals, and the sudden collapse of a flank where a hidden abbati sprawled, transformed confidence into confusion. The Mongol detachment attempted to regroup, but found itself hemmed against terrain that prevented classical escape. With reinforcements arriving from nearby garrisons and with Hungarian cavalry, called forward by diplomatic channels and fast-moving under a local commander cited in the sources as George Baka, the Polish force pressed the advantage. What the Mongols had prided themselves upon, mobility, cohesion, the capacity to fall back and reform, was neutralized where the ground betrayed them. Units that were meant to be agile were forced into slow, grinding exchanges they had not prepared for. To describe what followed with certainty is difficult. Chroniclers disagree on the precise course of the action and on which unit was cut off when. What emerges consistently is the same consequence. Mongol detachments at Waghoff suffered a severe reverse and were compelled to withdraw. The word annihilation appears in later retellings, sometimes amplified by patriotic memory. A cautious reading of the record suggests that the Mongol force there was smashed decisively enough that it could no longer act as a freely operating column in the theatre. Whether every man perished or a large portion escaped is ambiguous in the manuscripts. What mattered for the campaign was not the head count, but the operational effect. Momentum evaporated. While northern detachments bled at Waghoff, Nogai's southern column faced its own frustrations before Krov, Kruf, Kov, a fortress with several possible names in surviving texts. The siege played out like a mirror of the campaign's central paradox, Mongol speed versus Polish endurance. Nogai attempted the usual repertoire, siege ramps where wood was available, miners where the soil allowed tunneling, and repeated probes at gates. Defenders replied with sorties, boiling oil in some accounts, and continuous harassment of siege works. Stone walls held, and every failed sally by the Mongols further stretched their ability to feed men and horses. Many historians stress the cumulative weight of these small defeats, a night sortie that burns a siege engine, a well-defended tower that refuses to fall, a foraging party embarrassed and chased off. They are small scenes, but strung together, they become decisive. Intermittently, tradition feeds color to the cold arithmetic. According to later chronicles, rivermen, raftsmen who knew local streams like lines on their palms, slipped under the Mongol camp at night, setting blazes to tents and freeing horses. In one account, they even staggered through the muddy edge of a camp and cut down captains in their sleep. The tone of those stories is unmistakably folkloric, daring, cinematic, and easily told beside a fire in the following generation. Contemporary sources suggest small-scale river raids did occur. Whether they achieved the dramatic coup attributed to them in later retellings is uncertain. Still, as a strategic phenomenon, such actions contributed to an atmosphere of insecurity. Mongol commanders, perpetually alert to the possibility of ambush, were forced to assign men to guard duties they could ill afford, further draining the offensive potential of their columns. At Kruf, another name subject to variant spellings, another stage of the trap worked. Once a siege extended beyond immediate expectations, Mongol detachments that had been charged with raiding and plundering found themselves retasked to guard wagon trains, escort prisoners, and secure lines of communication. These auxiliaries were not the experience-heavy core. They were the weaker links that Polish harassment units sought. When Leszek's scouts discovered a Mongol convoy separated from the main body, its wagons groaning with booty and its guard thin, the decision to strike became obvious. The ambush near a wooded bend of a river was textbook. Concealment in the trees, the use of local terrain to prevent flight, and the hammer blow of concentrated cavalry emerging from a hidden flank. The Hungarians, whose expertise in open cavalry charges complemented Polish knowledge of local terrain, struck with brutal timing. Contemporary chroniclers report the capture of standards and banners, symbols of unit identity that mattered as much as any materiel. To the Mongols, whose command and control relied heavily on the visibility of signals and coherence of movement, the loss of those centering symbols struck a psychological blow that outlived the immediate tactical defeat. Across the campaign, a pattern was now clear. Mongol commanders, once able to detach freely and expect reunion in due course, had been turned into a dispersed array of targets. Their operational model, fast seizures, quick foraging and flexible regrouping, depended on relative security of rearward movement. That security evaporated under Polish harassment, stone resistance, and the knowledge that Allied cavalry could appear where scouts suggested a gap. What the Poles had built was not merely fortifications, but a contest of time. The longer a siege lasted, the more likely a concentrated relief would arrive. And arrive it did, at a point the chronicles single out as a decisive moment, a collation of forces at a place sometimes named Star or Stary Sącz in surviving manuscripts. Here a Mongol detachment, believed in the sources to be carrying booty and prisoners, was caught between prepared Polish positions and the sudden appearance of a relief column. Whether the Mongol force was lured into the attack or simple miscommunication left it exposed is debated by historians. What is not disputed is the outcome. The detachment was hit with such force and coordination that it ceased to function as a fighting body. The mechanics of the attack at Star combined what Poland had learned to do best. Harassment had funneled the enemy toward predictable routes. Scouts had identified a likely junction. Leszek, with advisors who trusted timing over haste, massed a relief column sufficiently fast to arrive at the point of contact. George Baka's Hungarian horsemen, if the sources are to be followed, played a crucial role, striking the Mongol flank at a moment when reorganization was impossible. Crossbows thinned the outermost ranks, heavy cavalry broke into the rearguard, skirmishers pressed in with daggers and short spears, as the Mongols attempted to scramble mounts and reform. The result was a collapse of the detachment's cohesion. Chroniclers later described piles of bodies, standards taken, and banners dragged through the mud with an almost theatrical relish. Again, such color must be handled carefully. These accounts mix fact, memory, and rhetorical flourish. What the scene at Star did for the campaign was to convert scattered embarrassments into a systemic defeat. A substantial Mongol element, whether a large portion or an elite detachment, was destroyed in terms of combat effectiveness. Its loss reverberated through the remaining columns. Confidence waned, and with it the willingness to risk another prolonged engagement in hostile and unpredictable country. For commanders like Nogai and Talabuga, the campaign's calculus changed from one of offensive options to one of consolidation and withdrawal. The strategic imperative of avoiding further losses now outweighed the original aims of plunder and submission. It is tempting to dramatize the moment as the point at which Mongol power collapsed in the field. That would be an overreach. The Mongol state remained formidable. Elsewhere their arms continued to hum with energy. But in Poland in 1287, 1288, a campaign that had begun with assumptions of easy raids and quick seizures ran aground on a new reality. The forbidden past the title evokes is the memory that strategic adaptation could invert the balance. Poland had not miraculously conjured an army equal to the Mongol host. It had rather engineered a landscape and a system that made Mongol strengths liabilities. What followed was a withdrawal. Nogai, judging the southern flank unsustainable, ordered a pullback in January of 1288, according to the chronology preserved in several sources. Talabuga, confronting the collapse of his northern detachments and the prospect of being struck by combined relief forces, also retreated. The Mongol columns withdrew along routes, offering safer lines of communication, carrying with them the bitter proof that their campaigns in Poland could no longer rely on the quick victories of earlier decades. Sources thin and diverge after that point. The Mongol record turns inward toward other theaters, and Polish chronicles turn toward the business of memorializing the campaign's outcomes. The consequences for Poland were immediate and longer term. In the short term, the retreat meant that major Mongol incursions into the core Polish lands ceased. For a generation at least, the threat of another sweeping invasion diminished. Politically, the campaign allowed figures like Leszek to point to a successful defense that, even if not total, helped legitimize more centralized coordination among dukes and urban elites. Economically, the survival of towns that might otherwise have been sacked preserved local markets and artisanal production. Strategically, the Polish state, still fragmented in Old Polish terms, came away with enhanced military doctrines. Fortifications would continue to be prioritized, garrison discipline would be institutionalized in key places, and the use of light cavalry for harassment, combined with heavier field forces in coordinated operations, became a staple. Equally important was the memory of the campaign. Chronicles and local annals preserved the events both as sober reports and as narratives of popular courage. Folk songs and regional tales took root, amplifying the role of commoners and named heroes. The River Raid story, the tale of an anonymous band of raftsmen striking at a Mongol camp under the moon, became a staple of that folklore. Other anecdotes, stranger, more intimate, also circulated. One chronicle, for instance, tells a lurid detail about identifying a fallen noble by an unusual foot injury. That story's function in the narrative is not to supply a forensic fact, but to underline the human cost and the moral of reversal. Historians treat such stories as chronicle claims, illuminating for cultural memory, slippery for strict reconstruction. Moreover, the campaign's memory fed civic rituals. Towns that had held out promoted annual commemorations. Local elites sponsored chapels and altars to give thanks. The narrative of a defensive triumph against a hitherto unstoppable foe became a tool of identity as much as history. There is a political reading here, victory stories buttressing the authority of dukes and communal leaders, but there is also a human one. Communities that had lived through terror sought stories that explained how they had survived. The idea that careful engineering, discipline, and solidarity could turn an existential threat into a contest won through ingenuity and persistence was a consoling moral. Yet the tale also leaves us with necessary caveats. The Mongol retreat did not mean the instant consolidation of a centralized Polish state. Internal divisions persisted. Rival dukes still bickered, and border pressure from neighbors remained. The Mongols did not vanish from the European strategic horizon. They continued to threaten and influence affairs in other regions. What changed in Poland was not destiny, but possibility. The country demonstrated that adaptation could blunt previously decisive advantages, and that innovation in fortification and command could produce strategic effect. That lesson resonates beyond the medieval battlefield. The campaign of 1287 to 1288 shows how a society's capacity to learn through rebuilding, rearming, and reorganizing can transform trauma into defense. The Mongol technique had been an engine of shock and speed. Poland's answer was a slower, less glamorous set of measures: stone walls, trained garrisons, better artillery, disciplined restraint in pursuit, and the cultivation of alliances. Together, These elements made the Mongol operational model costly and uncertain. It turned the invaders' velocity into vulnerability. There is an additional military moral often overlooked: strategic patience. The Poles did not meet shock with immediate head-on shock. They used time as a weapon. Protracted siege dynamics favored the defender only because the defender sustained supply, morale, and hope, while the attacker ran down his advantages. The seemingly passive act of holding a wall is, in a deeper sense, an act of calculation, one that defers risk in order to create a moment when the enemy must choose between continued attack and dangerous withdrawal. The trap, then, is temporal as much as physical. It's worth ending with reflection on sources and memory. Our knowledge of the 1287-1288 campaign weaves together contemporary reports, later chronicles, local annals, and archaeological hints. Names wobble in the manuscripts. Wagoff becomes Wag, Krov appears in several spellings, and Stary Sonch survives in variant forms. Some episodes read like legend, raft-borne saboteurs, intimate identification of the dead, while others fit the patterns of siegecraft and maneuver any competent commander could recognize. Responsible storytelling must hold both kinds of testimony: the exactitude demanded by military analysis and the suggestive power of tradition. Both tell us something important. The military detail explains how a trap was engineered. The legends explain how that trap came to mean something to the people who lived through it. So what does this vanished chapter of history, this forbidden past, teach us now? For one thing, power is not merely a matter of technology or numbers. It is also a matter of assumptions. The Mongols had assumptions about what the European landscape would allow. The Poles deliberately transformed those assumptions. Second, war is as much about information and cohesion as it is about courage. Where the Mongols lost coherence, Polish coordination gained purchase. Finally, memory matters. The stories people tell about survival shape future choices, incentivize institution building, and harden the civic will to invest in defenses. We end where the campaign itself ended, not with theatrical triumph, but with a practical, consequential withdrawal. The Mongol columns left Poland, their appetite for plunder in that theater curbed for the time being. Poland remained a contested space in the longer sweep of medieval Europe, but it had demonstrated that measured technical and political adaptation could blunt the edge of an overwhelming force. If this reconstruction of a forbidden past caught your attention, tell us in the comments. What other historical reversals, where preparation and adaptation turned the tide, captivate you? Share a favorite example. And if you enjoyed this deep military dive, subscribe and share this video with someone who loves stories of underdogs beating the odds. In the quiet that follows the clatter of weapons, history reminds us that nothing of lasting consequence is truly unstoppable if people are willing to learn, to build, and to hold.